I come to this moment with very mixed emotions. Proud of what the men and women of the Department of Justice have accomplished over the last 6 years, and at the same time, very sad that I will not be a formal part of the great things that this department and this president will accomplish over the next 2.
Eric Holder in Washington yesterday during his resignation. The president standing right next to him. 6 years, and the Eric Holder tenure now comes almost to a close. They still need to find someone to replace them. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Steve Malzberg Show. I'm Joe Concha, filling in for Steve today. My next guest is a regular here on the show, but we actually have a little bit of a history as well. No, we didn't date or anything like that, but we used to work together when he was an editor at Mediaite.com, where I currently work. So we've got a lot to talk about today. Please welcome now the associate editor of HotAir.com, the great Noah Rothman. Noah, thanks for being here on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you for having me, Joe. Appreciate it.
Sure. So how are things going over there, by the way? I read all of your stuff, and you work harder than almost any writer out there. It seems every day there's some very well thought out piece that I get to absorb.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. Yeah, I'm pushing pretty hard because we're expecting my first in any minute now period. So we're just trying to get as much content out there as possible before I disappear and become a full-time dad for a week.
If somehow you could have your wife go into labor and on camera behind you, what that will do for Newsmax ratings, I can't even begin to tell you. So if we could somehow arrange that, an epidural perhaps might be in order, that would be awesome.
I can assure you that I will absolutely not let that happen.
I think there's some SEC violations against showing that birth anyway, but as somebody who had a baby last year, as you know, congratulations in advance once again. So let's talk about first, obviously, the Holder resignation. That was the thought that we led with at the top of this block. And you say that the resignation is more about the midterms than anything else. Who do you think benefits in terms of the midterms in regards to Holder's resignation?
Well, it is the first and most clearest indication that the White House believes that it's really very likely, if not imminent, that their party will lose control of the Senate in the midterms. If the Republicans did not or did maintain control, or they took over the upper chamber, it would be unlikely that Holder would be able to resign at all. But it didn't come as much of a shock. Attorney generals don't normally stay for 2 consecutive terms. So his resignation was not all that surprising, but it will benefit, it could benefit Republicans, but it would most likely benefit Democrats and unenthused liberals who are otherwise not especially interested in casting a vote in November if, and only if, the president decides to nominate somebody who has a lot of bona fides on the left. And the 2 most likely candidates who would fit that bill are California's Attorney General Kamala Harris and the outgoing governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick. Now, I don't believe I've heard anybody float Harris's name in the short list that is being sent out as a trial balloon.
I haven't heard of it.
But Deval Patrick has been floated a couple of occasions. But from what I've been hearing, primarily actually from reporters, is that the White House isn't going to go that route, because they're not going to really try to inflame the base with what might be the impending confirmation fight, which will most likely be brought up in the lame duck session of Congress, but could in fact bleed over into the 114th Congress. But they're probably going to go with somebody who's a career justice official, or possibly even a former cabinet member like Janet Napolitano, or maybe even White House counsel Catherine Rimler.
That's interesting, and you obviously work with me at Mediaite, so you're very familiar with one Al Sharpton, who isn't familiar with the Reverend. He has a show on MSNBC at 6 o'clock Eastern Time, and not a lot of people watch. However, he somehow, throughout his tenure at MSNBC, has really gained access to some very important players, including the president himself, and then obviously Valerie Jarrett, who he says he exchanged regular emails with on a daily basis. Yesterday, Business Insider did an interview with him, and he said that he will be very influential in the decision-making process of the next Attorney General. Your thoughts on what is probably the best unintentional comedy out there right now?
I don't doubt that he was told that. I don't doubt that he has access to the White House and that he has regular correspondence with the president's advisors. He's met with the president on multiple occasions. I don't doubt that he was given assurances that he will have broad influence over the decision of who replaces Eric Holder as the top cop spot. I don't believe that he will, But I do believe it's beneficial for the White House to allow him to believe that. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in what Mr. Sharpton thinks his level of influence over the White House is. Although it is measurable. It's not infinitesimal. But he does have a little bit of a sway over this administration, but certainly not so much as that he'll play kingmaker for the next AG.
Yeah, it seems like the only quotes on Sharpton about his access to the White House come from Sharpton himself. Then again, you never hear the White House really refuting anything that Al's saying, or maybe they just want to let sleeping dogs lie. Let's turn to another story that you wrote, Noah, which I thought was great. Reporters furious over Clinton's totalitarianism, and this was at a recent Clinton Global Initiative event where reporters were actually tracked and monitored so much to the point where they were even followed into bathrooms. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, really, there's only one incident, and that was Amy Chozick, who writes for the New York Times, and she's slated to cover Clinton. She has been covering Clinton for some time, and the nascent Clinton 2016 campaign. And she was at the Clinton Global Initiative, where she was followed into the bathroom by one of the young minders to ensure, and all the way up into the stall and out, to ensure that she didn't get any unauthorized interviews.
Wow.
Not unauthorized. This is not odd behavior for the Clintons, especially at CGI. And it got to a point where members of the press were really upset over this, what Eric Wemple, who writes for the Washington Post, called totalitarianism. And Chris Cillizza also had a very similar take about how this was alienating the press, who is really somebody, if not an ally, then you need to have a rather cordial working relationship with in order to run an effective presidential campaign. And this is getting in the way of Clinton's presidential aspirations. I think Matt Continetti at Washington Free Beacon had
No, I got to wrap it up for you. I'm sorry about that. It looks like we're coming up on a hard break, but certainly everybody go to Hot Air, read that story, Reporters Furious over Clinton's totalitarianism. No, I wish we had more time. Unfortunately, we're up against it. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So we'll be back with the best of Give Me 5 after the break. But first, have you wondered where the president and his family lived before there was a White House or even a D.C., a District of Columbia? Well, let's take a look at the president's house before the White House with this hour's America's Place.
Visitors to Philadelphia's Liberty Bell are greeted by a bizarre structure that looks like a half-built home. It is actually an important monument to a tumultuous chapter of American history. This rebuilt frame of a 3-story brick mansion built in 1767 was a key operations center during the Revolution. It was here then military governor and notorious traitor Benedict Arnold lived. After the British evacuated the city, it was within these walls Arnold hatched his secret plan to betray his country. But its most famous residents were 2 American presidents, George Washington and John Adams. President Washington moved here in 1790 with servants and a staff of 30. While living here, Washington held receptions, public audiences, state dinners, and open houses, making the residence the official entertaining center of a new nation. He oversaw a major expansion and renovation of the home, including transforming a washroom into the president's private office. Washington, a Federalist, was instrumental in planning and ratifying the Bill of Rights. From here, he even planned the future Capitol, which bears his name, in the newly created District of Columbia. But his time here also illustrated the complicated growing pains of a new nation. Washington, a slave owner, took advantage of a Philadelphia law that permitted slaveholders moving into town to keep slaves for 6 months. Afterwards, the slaves were to be set free. Instead, Washington rotated his slaves between here and his home in Mount Vernon. Some escaped. Washington's slaves were freed in his will upon his death in 1799. Our second president, John Adams, also lived here until finally moving into the newly built president's house in Washington in 1800. Tragically, by the 1950s, despite a public outcry, what remained of the house and outbuildings were completely demolished to make way for Independence Mall. The house was lost forever, or so it seemed. In early 2000, during construction of a new Liberty Bell Center, portions of the foundation of the president's house were discovered. More controversy ensued as officials toiled over whether to even acknowledge the mansion and how to best portray features as the home's slave quarters. History is not neat, reads one of the site's transparent walls. It is complicated and messy. This house exposes the core contradiction at the founding of this nation: enshrinement of liberty and the institution of slavery. A civil war would later resolve this terrible contradiction. I'm Lucy Celia, and this is An American Place on Newsmax TV.